So what exactly is climate action and what is the history? How did we get here where one subject becomes the thing that occupies so many people, whether they're in the public sector, government, international organization, youth group, women? When was the last time we had something that is bringing us together this much like climate action is? On this episode, I get to break it down for you to show you the history of the major landmark global convenings that have happened leading to where we are right now. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. So now that you know the basics about climate action or climate in general, we need to go back to why it's a big deal in the first place. Why is everyone raging about climate change? So for those of us who do not know, there is a little bit of history when it comes to climate action, and I'll try to highlight for you the major global agreements that have brought us to where we are today. And these agreements are not getting any lesser important. In fact, they become the center of many of the global conversations and meetings as we go ahead. And so every single one of us needs to be aware of what's going on in the climate action space. So in 1992, there was a body that was formed. It's called the UNFCCC. It's a United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change. This is the UN body that deals with COP. When you hear of COP27 or COP28, it's a UN body that tracks the agreements or convenes the major meetings when it comes to climate change globally. They also host the regional meetings, so they're the ones that also host the Africa Climate Week or the Middle East Climate Week and all that. So when it comes to the conversation of where the climate conversation really started, as far as the UN is concerned, it started in 1992 when that was brought up as a body that was officially formed to address the issue of climate change. And then fast forward to 1997, and that's where you'll hear something called the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is basically a meeting that was held in Japan, and it was a global meeting again that was convened to address major issues, and climate change, of course, was the central pillar. In that meeting, that's where for the first time there was a proposal that the world needs to come together to deliberately and more strategically address the issue of climate change. Not many or all of the countries signed to it because I guess at the time there was no hype or, highlight of how important climate change was. But there were a few countries that came together to say we do need to begin as a globe to address the issue of climate change, and that's what is called the Kyoto Protocol. And then shortly after that, there was the medium development goals. The UN began to address or bring together medium development goals that were highlighting the 8 areas of focus that are supposed to be addressed by all the countries in the world, and together, converging towards these are the 8 things we want to focus on in the new millennium. And that started in January 2000. And so we moved to 2009, where there was a meeting held, again, another COP, and this was COP15. Now, this one is significant because that's where, for the first time, there was a commitment by the developed countries to set aside $100 billion every year for the developing nations to address the issue of climate. That was a major agreement, but for the most part, that's all it was, because unfortunately, a few years after that, it was evident that there was no money forthcoming, at least not to the level or degree of commitment that had been made in the COP15 in 2009 at Copenhagen. And so in 2015, they introduced something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And these were additional goals that were going to be in addition to the MDGs, which are the Medium Development Goals, that had run from 2000 to 2015. Now, in the introduction of the additional goals to make them 15, and that was 7 additional goals, Goal 13 was specifically dedicated to climate change. And that would mean that countries would need to specifically dedicate themselves to addressing, in addition to poverty and many other sustainable development goals at the time, they would need to now introduce the issue of climate. And that meant that there would be a drive to get the different sectors involved, from the private sector, the business community, the young people, the women, as we're addressing issues of gender, how do they affect or how are they affected by climate change? And so that was the reason why it was added as a 13th goal, because it needed its own individual focus. And then we build up to, again, in that particular year, there was another UN meeting, a COP meeting that was held to review the commitment that had been made in the COP15, which was held in 2009. And at this point in the review, there was evidence that not much had happened. And again, over the years, again in 2018 and in 2021, there was continued evidence that the commitment that had been made of availing $100 billion every single year for developing countries had not been honored by the developed world. And so one of the questions that needs to be asked, even as the meetings continue to happen year after year, and even as we're looking at COP28 being held in Dubai in just shy of 2 months now, the question is what's going to be different? Because in every single one of these COPs is always a landmark conversation or a document that has been approved or agreed upon. But then the question is, how does that translate to action long after the COPs have been held? And so in this case, after the conversations, there was a need to review and say, and the agreement in 2018 was that the deadline, which was initially set at 2020 to allow for the $100 billion would be extended to 2025. And so we're still watching and waiting, and that has not happened so far. Now, in last year, and this is now 2022, in the COP that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, that again was a landmark COP and a global meeting that was held. And in that COP, a lot of the global South countries came together and said, this thing is not working. And they were reviewing and saying, why are we waiting for the goodwill of the developed countries that have developed largely on fossil fuels to pay back or to contribute towards the climate action or mitigation and adaptation that needs to happen in the developing countries? Rather than wait on their goodwill, let's address the issue of the global finance infrastructure. And that's what you may or may not have heard that is called the Bridgetown Agenda. The Bridgetown Agenda is basically an initiative that is driven by the Prime Minister of Barbados, that's Mia Mottley, and she initiated this idea of the need to restructure the global finance infrastructure to make sure that it's more equitable, especially for the developing countries and for the global South countries. And there's a whole history. We did cover a little bit of it in a previous episode, where we talked about the history around why we are where we are in terms of the financial infrastructure, the global financial infrastructure. From when the UN was formed to when the Bretton Woods institutions, and the Bretton Woods institutions are the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, and all those kind of organizations, when they were formed, why they were formed, how they were formed, whose interests they were serving at the time, because they were formed right after the Second World War, all the way to right now. Not much of it has changed. And that's part of the Bridgetown Agenda, the need to restructure the financial institutions to be more relevant to the current scenario, where you do not have an Africa that is sitting and waiting for solutions, but it's actually raising their hands and saying, we do have solutions to global challenges as well. And we want to be able to borrow at the same interest rates as other countries. And so the push right now from COP27 was, can the global financial infrastructure be changed? For those that are wondering, we're still on climate action. And the reason is you cannot speak about climate action without speaking about finance, global finance, development finance. And development finance is largely handled by the Bretton Woods institutions, or in many cases, it sets the tone. If you see the kind of funding that is lent to different countries, it comes from these kinds of institutions. And for as long as they are skewed adversely or negatively towards the developing countries, they remain on the back foot. And so the pressure right now that was meted at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last year was, can this change? So that instead of waiting for the funding to come from the developed countries in terms of the 100 billion that was committed, we could use our own resources. If there could be better interest rates, we could have a lot more left with us to be able to develop and address the kind of development or sustainable development that we need as developing nations. So the question has always been, what's a balance between the current development and the need for more sustainable development? Current development, you could look at, we still need to build roads, we still need to build schools, we still need to feed our population as developing countries. But at the same time, there's this push towards, for example, going green, that you need to invest a lot more in green energy. You need to invest a lot more in climate smart agriculture. It's a way to go. But then at this point, there's a lot of, it's a dilemma for many of the developing countries, especially because the resources are scarce. And so the push in the Bridgetown Agenda is, if you do restructure, the lending rates, or create instruments that allow developing countries to be able to have sufficient funding to be able to develop at the same time, making sure that they are climate resilient, then they'll be able to do that as opposed to, like I said earlier, relying or waiting for someone else to do that for them. And so that was COP27 held in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. And so the output was, because that was just an idea that was fronted by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Macron, who's the Prime Minister of France, raised his hand and said, I would like to host a meeting that will be able to break down what this Bridgetown agenda is. And he offered to host a summit, and that summit was held in June. But between COP27 and June this year, there were a lot of meetings and committees that were held together to have different consultative meetings and technical meetings to break down if the global financial infrastructure is to be restructured, how would that look like? What would that look like, and what needs to be done? And so the June meeting was considered successful because there was a lot of output that came from the developing countries, from the developed nations. And at that point, if you do remember, there was a need and a pressure to change even the leadership within the Bretton Woods institutions, specifically in the World Bank, to have a more pro-climate leadership that would enable for lending or restructuring of the many programs that they do to be able to address more climate issues within their funding. And so that led to the Africa Climate Summit. And in the Africa Climate Summit, it was a drill down or a distilling of what does Africa want? What is Africa's position on many of the issues, especially on the issue of climate change in particular, but specifically on the issue of financing. And the position taken, we've done this quite a bit, so I won't go into the details, was we would need to offer solutions and see Africa as a place that has opportunity, or see climate change as an opportunity as opposed to a challenge. And that's where we are right now. And the next meetings held were in New York at the UN General Assembly, and the SDG Summit, which were combined. In the SDG Summit, it was a review to say, we've already gone halfway through the SDGs from 2015 until now. We have another 7 years to go. Where are we? And the report was not exactly encouraging, especially on the climate change issue, but generally on all the other 17 SDGs. And it was evident that the world needs to do a whole lot more to address the issues that are plaguing the world, and that different nations need to be a bit more ingenious and creative in how they approach the issue of sustainable development goals. And if you notice, the goals were completely embedded in sustainability, which means that even as you're addressing the issue of gender, there is an element of sustainability to it. As you're addressing the issue of hunger, there is an element of sustainability to it. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because as we move into the discussion of green jobs, it's cutting across everywhere. And it is in your best interest, especially as a young person in Africa, to be able to know exactly how to position yourself and how best you can leverage or benefit from the coming pressure or push. And so you could probably be asking, so what next? And what exactly are these meetings achieving? And we at Jacob's Ladder actually believe that the convenings are important, but like many people keep on asking, we must be able to not just track the implementation, but actually get to implementation. There should be some form of incentive, for example, for countries that are implementing climate action or climate resilient development in their countries, besides their own population benefiting. Can there be a recognition of best practices? In fact, I was part of a review of the SDGs in New York 2 weeks ago, and one of the issues that kept coming up is we just don't have any best practices that are out there that show that some countries are getting it right or some countries are not. Can we be able to have celebrations around countries that are getting it right, and then begin to say, how can we localize or make sure that this can be adopted in other different countries? And so like you're asking, what next? The next meeting that's being held is COP28. And as usual, we will definitely keep you updated, keep you abreast on what's going on and what the essence of COP28 is. We will be featuring that as a road to COP sort of like series, but we'll get back to that later. And so there you have it. That's a history of climate action and why it's a big deal, and why you as an individual needs to be not just aware, but informed and actively engaged in it, because everything is going sustainability. You know, there's a whole theme around sustainability. So please do get into the action. And so should you have questions, comments, contributions, opinions as well, we'd like to hear them. You know, you could share them with us on the comment section below on our various social media platforms. We'd love to hear from you, so please contact us on that. It's been amazing hanging out with you, and I look forward to hearing from you, first of all, and getting to know what are young people, especially in Africa, thinking about all these convenings that have been going on, and what does the future look like. It's great to know the history, but what does the future look like for us? From my end, it's definitely positive. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa.